Clara had always considered herself a quiet woman. Her apartment on the third floor of a modest city building was her sanctuary, place where she could retreat from the noise and chaos of life. She enjoyed the little routines, brewing her morning coffee, reading a book by the window, listening to the distant hum of the city below. It was peaceful, predictable, and safe. But recently, that sense of safety had begun to shift. A presence had emerged in her life that she hadn't anticipated, and it stirred feelings she didn't fully understand. Her neighbor, Daniel, lived in the apartment next door. They had known each other in passing for some time. Polite nods in the hallway, brief chats about the weather, and the occasional borrowed sugar or salt. Daniel had a girlfriend, Sophie, who visited on weekends, and together they seemed like the picture of a happy young couple. From her apartment, Clara could sometimes hear their laughter drifting through the walls. And it was the kind of warmth she could almost feel but never touch. One rainy Tuesday evening, there was a soft knock at her door. Clara, wrapped in her oversized sweater, opened it to find Daniel standing there, slightly damp from the rain. He held an envelope in one hand, looking hesitant, almost vulnerable. "Hi, Clara," he said softly. I think this came by mistake. Could it be yours?" His eyes were anxious, and she noticed a tension in his shoulders that made her heart soften. "Of course," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. He shook off his coat, and she could see the worry etched lightly on his face. They sat in the living room, the rain pattering against the windows, and they began talking. At first it was small talk, the envelope, the weather, her work. Clara was a graphic designer, often lost in her designs and client deadlines, while Daniel worked in real estate, a career that demanded patience and charm. But as the conversation unfolded, it quickly became more than polite chatter. He spoke about the small stresses of his life, about projects that had gone wrong and opportunities that had slipped by. Clara listened intently, offering encouragement, suggestions, and the occasional smile. Daniel's voice had a calm sincerity, a tone that made her feel important, heard, and understood. It was rare, she realized, to meet someone who truly listened without interruption. Without the pretense of judgment, the evening stretched longer than either of them expected. They spoke about childhood memories, favorite books, and the oddities of city life. Clara found herself laughing more freely than she had in weeks. Daniel had a gentle humor, the kind that didn't demand attention but quietly drew you in. She noticed how his eyes lit up when he talked about his passions, how his hands moved slightly when he emphasized a point. The connection was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else but to Clara. It felt meaningful. As the rain continued to fall, the conversation shifted. Daniel mentioned Sophie casually, speaking of her with affection, but also with a quiet honesty that suggested complexity in their relationship. Clara nodded, understanding that no relationship was without its challenges. Daniel didn't overshare or complain. He simply spoke truthfully about his feelings, about the moments when life felt heavy and he needed someone to lean on. Clara felt a flutter in her chest, an emotional response she hadn't anticipated. She realized that she was not just listening to a neighbor. She was connecting with someone who had become unexpectedly important in her life. There was a warmth in the room, a shared space of comfort and trust. She could feel herself opening in ways she hadn't in years. She found herself leaning slightly forward when he spoke, absorbing every word, cherishing the quiet intimacy that had grown between them in a single evening. Daniel, for his part, seemed equally affected. There were pauses in the conversation, moments where he looked at her with a sincerity that suggested he felt a bond too. He wasn't touching her, he wasn't crossing boundaries, but the unspoken understanding between them was tangible. He trusted her. He felt safe in her presence. And in that room with the rain outside and the soft glow of the lamp, Clara felt the same way. Eventually, the evening came to a close. Daniel stood, hesitated, and then spoke softly. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice tinged with something deeper than gratitude. "I don't know why, but I feel lighter after talking to you. Rare for me to feel this way with anyone." Clara smiled, a mixture of warmth and surprise at the depth of their exchange. "I'm glad you feel comfortable," she said. "It's nice to talk to someone who understands." He lingered for a moment at the door. their eyes meeting in a quiet acknowledgement of what had passed between them. Then he stepped into the rain, waved briefly, and disappeared down the hall. Clara closed the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly. Her heart was still racing, her mind swirling with thoughts she hadn't expected to confront. Who was this connection she felt? And why did it feel so significant, so immediate, and so complicated? That night, sleep was elusive. Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening in her mind. She thought about Daniel's eyes, the gentleness of his voice, the way he had listened so attentively. She realized that she had not felt this alive, this seen, in years. The emotional intimacy they had shared was intoxicating in its simplicity. It wasn't physical, it wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. But it was deeply moving. Over the next few days, she noticed subtle changes in herself. Her thoughts drifted toward him unexpectedly. She found herself smiling at the memory of his laugh, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking. Even mundane tasks felt lighter when she imagined him. Like a silent companion who understood her in a way no one else did. Daniel's visits became more frequent, always seemingly innocent, always needing her insight or advice. Sometimes it was a question about a minor home repair, sometimes a discussion about a new book he was reading. Each time the room seemed to shrink around them, the world outside fading, leaving just the two of them and the warmth they created in each other's presence. Clara began to realize that emotional intimacy could be powerful, even overwhelming. She found herself anticipating his visits, feeling a flutter of nervous excitement whenever he knocked. It wasn't infatuation in the shallow sense, but something deeper, a connection of hearts, of trust, of quiet understanding. She also began to recognize the tension it created within her. Daniel had Sophie, and Clara had her own sense of ethics and personal boundaries. But the heart did not always follow rules. And while she was careful not to overstep, she could not deny the pull she felt toward him, the yearning for the companionship and understanding he provided. By the end of the week, Clara understood that her life had shifted. She had opened her door to a neighbor, to a friend, to someone who had unexpectedly become essential to her emotional well-being. And she knew, without knowing exactly how, that the coming weeks would test her understanding of connection, boundaries, and the quiet, complex pull of human hearts. The rain had stopped, leaving the city glistening and quiet, and Clara stood by the window, reflecting. She realized that life was rarely simple, rarely predictable. Sometimes it brought unexpected people, moments of connection that changed everything in subtle, profound ways. And as she looked down the hall at Daniel's apartment, she felt anticipation, curiosity, and a touch of fear about what the next evening would bring, knowing in her heart that her life had quietly begun to change. After that first rainy evening, Daniel's visits became more frequent. Clara found herself anticipating the soft knock on her door almost as much as the morning coffee she cherished. Each time he arrived, she felt a mixture of excitement and caution. She reminded herself constantly that Daniel had Sophie and that she had to respect boundaries. But the emotional pull was undeniable. It started innocently, with small conversations about everyday matters. Daniel would stop by to borrow a pen, discuss a new book, or share a funny story from his work. Yet, over time, the small gestures became layered with meaning. His eyes would linger just a little longer. His voice would soften when speaking directly to her. And the pauses between their sentences carried a weight that neither had voiced aloud. Clara felt the subtle electricity of understanding and companionship growing between them. One evening, Daniel arrived carrying a takeout bag, his expression unusually contemplative. "I thought maybe we could have dinner together," he said quietly. Clara hesitated, mindful of Sophie, but something about the way he looked, open, honest, and vulnerable, made her nod. They ate together at her small kitchen table, the sound of silverware against plates punctuating their conversation. It wasn't a romantic dinner, not in the traditional sense, but there was a closeness in the shared meal, an intimacy built on presence and attention. They spoke about their dreams that night, Daniel revealed that he had always wanted to travel more, to see the coastlines of California and the mountains of Colorado. Clara shared her own unfulfilled ambitions, a dream of illustrating a children's book, a project she had shelved in the busyness of life. As they talked, laughter and quiet reflections intertwined, creating a rhythm that felt deeply familiar. Clara realized she was no longer simply listening to a neighbor. She was sharing pieces of herself that she rarely offered anyone. Over the following week, their routine settled into something predictable, yet extraordinary. Each evening, Daniel would knock, and Clara would feel a small thrill she couldn't suppress. Their conversations became deeper, exploring subjects that were often left unspoken with others: fears, insecurities, hopes, and past regrets. Daniel spoke candidly about the tension in his relationship with Sophie, not in complaint, but in honest acknowledgement of how life had subtly shifted their bond. Clara listened without judgment, offering understanding and support, and in return, Daniel showed a trust she hadn't encountered in years. It was during one of these nights that Clara first noticed how complicated her feelings had become. Daniel laughed at something trivial she said, and for a moment the world outside seemed to vanish. She saw him as more than a friend, more than a neighbor, someone who understood her on a level that surprised her. She caught herself watching him as he spoke, noticing the subtle gestures, the way his eyes softened when he smiled. The attraction wasn't physical. It was emotional, a deep connection that made her heart ache with longing and appreciation. Daniel seemed aware of the effect he had on her, though he never crossed a line. His visits were always courteous, his words chosen carefully. Yet there was an undercurrent, a recognition of the bond growing between them, quiet but undeniable. Clara found herself thinking about him during the day, smiling at his text messages, replaying their conversations, feeling warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years. One evening, Daniel arrived looking more serious than usual. He sat on the edge of her couch, hands clasped, and spoke softly. "Clara, I've been thinking a lot about everything," he began. "About Sophie, about us, about how complicated life can be. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I can't ignore how I feel when I'm here with you." Clara's breath caught. She understood the weight of his words, the balance between honesty, loyalty, and the undeniable connection they shared. She remained calm, reminding herself that boundaries mattered, that respect for his relationship was essential. But she also acknowledged the truth in her own heart. "I feel the same way," she admitted quietly. "I care about you and I appreciate every moment we spend talking. But we have to be careful." Daniel nodded, relief and tension mingling in his expression. They spent the rest of the evening talking openly about their emotions. They explored what it meant to care for someone deeply without overstepping boundaries, how companionship could be intimate without being physical, and the subtle ways human hearts could connect even amidst complicated circumstances. As the night wore on, the rain began to fall again, tapping gently against the windows. Clara felt a strange mix of fear and comfort. Fear of the complexities that lay ahead. Comfort in knowing that someone truly saw her, understood her, and shared her thoughts without judgment. Their conversation drifted to memories of childhood and adolescence, stories of family and friends, and the quiet disappointments life had dealt them. In those moments, the weight of isolation she had carried for so long seemed to lift, replaced by connection, understanding, and shared humanity. The next few days were filled with subtle tension. Clara noticed herself anticipating Daniel's arrival, wondering what he would say, how he would look, and what small nuances in his behavior would reveal his inner thoughts. She found herself smiling more freely, laughing at his jokes, and even feeling a lightness in her steps as she moved through her apartment. The emotional intimacy they shared was like a warm current running beneath the surface of everyday life, unseen by the world but profoundly affecting her. Daniel, too, seemed changed. He carried a quiet energy into their conversations, a willingness to explore emotions that he had rarely expressed with others. He spoke about life's uncertainties, dreams unfulfilled, and the subtle beauty of small, shared moments. Clara realized that she was witnessing not only his vulnerability, but also his growth. Their connection wasn't reckless or inappropriate. It was mutual support, a deepening friendship that both challenged and comforted them. One evening, Daniel arrived later than usual. The building was silent, the city lights casting a gentle glow through Clara's windows. He appeared weary, his usual charm tempered by fatigue. "It's been a long day," he admitted, sitting heavily on her couch. Clara handed him a cup of tea, and they sat in comfortable silence, the warmth of the liquid in their hands mirroring the warmth between them. They spoke sparingly at first, then slowly opened up, sharing small confessions and unspoken fears. Daniel admitted that he had begun to question his relationship with Sophie. Not out of dissatisfaction, but out of recognition that feelings could shift over time. Clara listened without judgment, offering understanding and perspective. In turn, she shared moments of loneliness she had long kept hidden. The quiet struggles of living a life that often felt disconnected from others. By the end of the evening, a sense of calm had settled over them. They had not crossed any lines. They had not breached trust or ethical boundaries. Yet the emotional bond had strengthened. Clara felt a new depth in her connection to Daniel, one that transcended mere friendship. She realized that intimacy was not always physical. Sometimes it was the simple act of being present, listening, and caring in a way that allowed another person to feel truly seen. The days that followed brought a new rhythm. Daniel continued to visit, their conversations deepening, exploring topics that ranged from mundane daily routines to profound life reflections. Clara found herself reflecting on her own desires, her own boundaries, and the ways in which human connection could enrich life without causing harm. She discovered that emotional closeness could be transformative, that trust and understanding could foster a sense of belonging she had longed for but rarely found. Yet, amid the comfort, there was tension. Clara recognized the fragility of the situation. Daniel had Sophie, a relationship that mattered to him, and she had her own sense of ethics. They navigated these moments carefully, aware of the delicate balance between emotional support and moral responsibility. Each conversation, each shared moment was imbued with awareness, mindfulness, and an unspoken commitment to honesty. By the end of the second week, Clara and Daniel had formed an unspoken pact. Their connection was real, meaningful, and emotionally charged, yet restrained. They were allies in a world that often felt isolating, offering each other companionship, understanding, and trust. It was a bond that neither could have predicted, but both had come to rely upon. That night, as Clara prepared for bed, she reflected on the transformation she had undergone. The quiet evenings with Daniel had awakened feelings of anticipation, empathy, and emotional intimacy she had long thought dormant. She understood that life often presented unexpected connections, relationships that were profound not because of physical intimacy, but because of the shared understanding of hearts and minds. And as she drifted into sleep, the memory of Daniel's laughter, his thoughtful eyes, and the gentle warmth of his presence lingered, a reminder that human connection, in all its forms, could be a source of comfort, growth, and even quiet joy, even when boundaries were respected and lines carefully maintained. Clara woke up that morning with a strange mix of anticipation and unease. Daniel hadn't come by the previous evening, and she felt the absence of his presence in her apartment like a missing piece of a puzzle. The quiet of her space seemed heavier, and she realized how much those conversations had come to mean to her. She spent the morning moving through her routines, yet her thoughts kept drifting toward him, to the warmth of his smile, the sincerity in his voice, and the feeling that he truly understood her in a way few ever had. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at her door. Her heart skipped a beat, and she hurried to answer, half hoping it would be Daniel and half dreading the weight of unspoken emotions. When she opened the door, there he was, slightly out of breath, holding a small package. "Hey," he said, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I thought you might like this." It was a book, one she had casually mentioned weeks ago, a story she had wanted to read but never had the time. The gesture was small, thoughtful, and deeply personal. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. She invited him in, and they sat together on the couch, unwrapping the package and flipping through the pages, discussing the cover, the plot, and the characters. The room felt cozy, intimate, yet perfectly safe, a sanctuary for connection without crossing boundaries. As the afternoon unfolded, their conversation took a more reflective turn. Daniel spoke about his relationship with Sophie, about the complexities of love, loyalty, and personal growth. Clara listened, understanding that life was rarely simple, that relationships could be messy, and that emotional connections could appear in unexpected places. She realized that her bond with Daniel was not a betrayal. It was a friendship, an emotional refuge, and a source of understanding that enriched both their lives. Daniel, for his part, seemed equally aware of the delicate balance between closeness and boundaries. He shared stories of his childhood, moments of vulnerability, and times when he had felt alone despite being surrounded by people. Clara responded with her own reflections, revealing fears, hopes, and small dreams she had tucked away for years. In those moments, the world outside ceased to matter. The city hummed faintly through the windows, but inside there was only the shared presence, the unspoken acknowledgement of understanding and trust as evening approached. The light outside shifted to a warm golden hue, and Clara realized that she had not felt this alive in a long time. The conversations with Daniel were not only comforting, but transformative. They allowed her to explore her emotions, confront her own desires for connection, and acknowledge the power of emotional intimacy. She understood now that love, attraction, and attachment could manifest in many ways, not all of which were physical or conventional. Their talks began to include laughter, gentle teasing, and playful challenges. Daniel had a way of noticing small details about her, the way she sipped her tea, how she tilted her head when she thought, the quiet smile that appeared when she was pleased. Clara, in turn, noticed the care he put into small gestures, the way he would pause to truly listen, the thoughtfulness in his comments, the subtle ways he made her feel seen. It was a connection grounded in respect and mutual awareness, a bond that deepened with every shared story and quiet moment. One evening, as rain began to tap against the windows once more, Daniel shared something personal. "Clara," he said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about how people come into our lives. Some connections are fleeting, but some change us in ways we can't ignore. I feel that with you." Clara's heart quickened. She understood exactly what he meant. This connection was transformative, a reminder that human bonds could be powerful without needing to cross moral or physical lines. Clara responded with honesty. "I feel it too," she admitted softly, "and I cherish it. But we have to navigate it carefully. It matters to me that we respect the people in our lives while still valuing this connection." Daniel nodded, and for a moment, silence spoke louder than words. They simply sat together, acknowledging the depth of what they shared without needing to define it further. Over the next few days, Clara noticed subtle changes in herself. She carried a lighter energy, a renewed sense of purpose, and a deeper understanding of her own emotions. The anticipation of Daniel's visits was no longer fraught with confusion or guilt. Instead, it was a source of joy, a reminder that meaningful connections could exist in ways that honored everyone involved. She began to notice small moments in her day more vividly, the way sunlight fell through her window, the distant laughter of children playing outside, the quiet hum of the city. Everything seemed richer, more vibrant, because her heart had been touched in ways that mattered. Daniel's presence became a steady rhythm in her life. They would meet in the evenings, discuss books, movies, and life, or simply sit together in comfortable silence. They shared small victories, frustrations, and dreams. Clara found herself confiding in him more openly than she had with anyone in years, and Daniel reciprocated, revealing layers of his personality that few had seen. In those moments, they were equals to people navigating life, understanding one another, and finding solace in shared experience. One night, Daniel arrived unusually quiet. He sat on the couch, hands clasped, and took a deep breath. "Clara," he said, "I think this connection we have, it's more important than either of us realized. It's taught me so much about myself, about care, respect, and understanding. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that this has changed me. Clara reached out and touched his hand lightly, a gesture of empathy, trust, and connection. It has changed me too, she replied, and I'm grateful. We've learned so much from each other. As the conversation deepened, they discussed boundaries, ethical responsibility, and the ways they could nurture their bond without causing harm. They acknowledged that life was rarely straightforward, that relationships were complex, and that emotional intimacy could exist independently of romantic or physical attraction. In embracing this understanding, they found freedom, the freedom to care deeply, to connect meaningfully, and to grow as individuals without compromising values. The days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of their companionship solidified. Clara began to see Daniel not just as a neighbor, but as a confidant, a mentor in understanding human emotions and a mirror reflecting her own growth. Daniel, in turn, found in Clara a partner in conversation, a steady presence in his otherwise turbulent life, and a reminder that meaningful relationships could take many forms. Clara noticed that her perception of life had shifted. The world no longer felt lonely or isolating. She had learned to recognize and appreciate emotional intimacy, to honor the subtle power of connection without needing it to conform to societal expectations of romance or passion. She began applying this understanding to other relationships as well, noticing how listening, empathy, and presence could transform ordinary interactions into meaningful bonds. One evening, as autumn leaves swirled outside, Daniel and Clara shared a long conversation on her balcony. They spoke about dreams, hopes, and fears, laughter mingling with quiet reflection. Daniel admitted that he had never experienced a connection quite like this before, one that was simultaneously freeing and grounding. Clara agreed, acknowledging that life often offered unexpected gifts, and it was up to individuals to recognize and nurture them responsibly. By the time the night ended, Clara felt a deep sense of peace. She realized that the bond they shared was enduring not because it was romantic or physical, but because it was authentic, ethical, and mutually enriching. Daniel's presence in her life had taught her about the importance of honesty, trust, empathy, and emotional courage. And in those lessons, she had found joy, fulfillment, and a profound understanding of herself and her capacity to connect. At the final days of their story together unfolded with a quiet grace. Daniel continued his visits, each interaction marked by trust, warmth, and emotional clarity. They discussed the ordinary and the extraordinary, comforted each other through challenges, and celebrated small victories together. Their connection had become a sanctuary, space where both could be fully themselves without fear, judgment, or compromise of values. Clara knew that life would continue to present challenges and changes, but she also understood that meaningful connections, when nurtured responsibly, could transform the way one approached relationships, emotions, and personal growth. Daniel had come into her life unexpectedly, not to disrupt, but to illuminate. And in that illumination, Clara discovered a depth of understanding, compassion, an emotional richness she had never known. As she watched him leave that final evening, the city lights reflecting off the wet streets, Clara felt a quiet gratitude. Their bond had not required violation of boundaries or ethical compromise. It had been built on conversation, presence, trust, and mutual respect. And in that, she found a lasting lesson that human connection in its purest form could be both transformative and safe, powerful and gentle, emotional and entirely wholesome.